Good evening, barflies and lounge lizards, and tonight we're going to be talking about my favorite sword and sorcery toy lines, all of which, spoiler, just happen to be from the 80s. But the 80s was just such a great time for sword and sorcery toy lines. A big part of it had to do with the success of Masters of the Universe, and I'd say another big part of it had to do with the success of the Conan the Barbarian film. But there will not be any Motu on this list, simply because I think that's been covered just a little bitty bit. So I'll just stick to all my other favorite sword and sorcery toy lines. And number 5 on the list is The Lost World of the Warlord from 1982 by Rimco. And just to start off, I am a big Rimco fan. They are such an underrated toy company of the time, and I have just as many childhood memories attached to their products as some of the big companies like Kenner or Mattel, maybe even more so. But The Lost World of the Warlord was a 5.5-inch figure line based on the DC comic The Warlord by Mike Grell, which began in 1976. And this is a line that gets labeled a Motu knockoff. I don't like the term knockoff. To me, that would indicate poor quality and no real value on its own. Sure, it came out to capitalize on Masters of the Universe, but this was a nice line of really nice quality action figures with great sculpts and a really groovy packaging as well. Surprisingly though, I mostly missed out on this line at the time, but I did have the Mikola figure, which I really dug, and even though he was a good guy, he looked like a villain. Definitely had a vampire-like quality to him, so he got a lot of use probably as a buff studly Dracula, which that's always what Draculas have been missing, buff studliness. There were 6 unique figures in this line, most of which were from the Warlord comic, with the exception of Arak and Hercules, which were borrowed from other DC comics. And number 4 on the list is Black Star from 1983 to 1985 by Galoob. And this is not only one of the longest running lines on this list, but it's a really unique case as well. Black Star started in 1981, predating Masters of the Universe, as a 13-episode animated series by Filmation, but it was prematurely canceled. But then Motu hit, so Black Star was rerun between 83 and 84, and along with it came an amazing toy line. Ratings were good for this second run of the series, yet a second season never happened for some reason. But we're here to talk about the toys, and this is easily one of my favorite lines of all time. I probably had more Black Star figures than I did Motu figures, or at least very close. They weren't as buff as Masters of the Universe or the aforementioned Warlord, but they were much taller, and each figure came packaged with a second minifigure. In the case of the heroes, it was a small, pink, dwarf-like creature called a Trobbit. Extremely Filmation-esque in design. If you're familiar with Filmation's design work, they fit right in there. And the bad guys came with little goblin-esque demon figures. Then for the second and third wave, the first wave was re-released as well with a really spiffy sparking feature in their chest. You just ran your thumb down this thing on their back and their chest sparked. But I've never been one that cared much about play gimmicks, and I actually disliked action features as a kid. It was all about the design, and these were extremely cool looking and unique. The Lava Dragon was one of my absolute favorite toys of my entire youth. The line also had some great vehicles and mounts. The standout being Black Star's Dragon Warlock. This thing towered over any of my other toys of the similar kind. And it just really lent itself to a lot of different play lines. You could use that in almost anything. And he had glow-in-the-dark teeth, much like myself. Another figure I feel needs spotlighting was Clone the Cloud Cat, which again was a very Filmation-esque elf-like design. But he came with these snap-on pieces that turned him into a cat creature. Sure, his back was still humanish, but if it's good enough for Atom Power, it's good enough for Clone. And number 3 on the list are the Warrior Beast from 1982 by Rimco. Now this is another really interesting case. The Warrior Beasts were their own individual toy line of around 5-inch figures, but at the same time, they were also meant to be the villains for the Lost World of the Warlord line. The two even shared a card back, even though there was no actual lore connecting the two. So it was really just kind of a great and unique way to cross-promote 2 two separate lines. And what a line this was of monster and animal-like barbarian warriors. Very high quality with great sculpts. There were 9 unique characters and a few variants within those 9. My personal favorites were the Snake Man, which paired up very nicely with the Masters of the Universe Snake Men, and the Wolf Warrior, which was my go-to for a werewolf toy for years and years. You know, thinking about it now, as I'm recording this, as a kid, I could have used Buff Studley Dracula figure along with Buff Studley Werewolf figure. Of course, there was no real mythology to the Warrior Beast, being strictly a toy line, but as a kid, I tended to really like that, making up my own stories and adventures, not being limited to who a character actually was. And I can honestly say, I liked my Snake Man figure every bit as much as any figure from the Big Boy action figure lines. Another interesting case here was the Skullman figure, which began very Skeletor-esque, but for unknown reasons, possibly legal, they changed up the head sculpt to another kind of cool, unique sculpt. Yet another really interesting thing about this line is that it actually has seen a little revival here lately. A company called Otherw World has started producing new, I guess you'd say, variants of not only the Warrior Beast, but also similar lines like Realm of the Underworld and Pirates of the Galaxies. Good Mr. J Super Awesome has been collecting these. And on that, we should take a break.
It's Digital Daredevil. That's the way you say the name. Getting a motorcycle over obstacles is the way you play the game. If you want to be a player, you have to move the cycle just right. And if you don't play real careful, you'll see a flashing light. You can play at lower high speeds and even control the jump. And if you're really a good player, the cycle gets through without a bump. Batteries not included. Digital Daredevil, the digital motorcycle stunt game, is made by Tomy.
Okay, this is Advanced Dungeons & Dragons video game cartridge.
You have to buy it separately to play on the Intellivision video game system.
Mom and Dad have to hook it up to the TV. What next? We're trying to find a crown, but it's real easy to get lost. So don't be surprised if the dragon finds you first. Holy cats, you just killed the dragon. I'm sorry, I didn't mean it.
Advanced Dungeons & Dragons video game cartridge and Intellivision master component from Mattel Electronics, each sold separately.
And we're back. And number 2 on the list is The Other World from 1982 to 1984 by Arco. And this is probably the most unique line on this list in that they weren't traditional action figures, nor were they in the Masters of the Universe style. Instead, The Other World were a full line of bendy figures around the G.I. Joe height, with a wide range of glow-in-the-dark accessories, and the first wave, much like Black Star, came with little companion figures. There were 11 unique characters, all with extremely unique designs. The heroes were quite barbarian in nature, but then the villains look like alien barbarians and are some of the coolest looking villains in any line ever. So I'd agree. A particular standout was the Weapons Master, who was a wolf-type creature who came with a big old weapons rack just full of glow-in-the-dark goodness. But where this line really shined was in the mounts and beasts, some of which were bendy, like the amazing Fragacuda, which was kind of an alligator meets frog and one of my favorite toys growing up. That Joker probably got more play at the time than anything else on this list. But there was also the mounts, which were hard plastic, other than their heads, and though articulated, they had wheels beneath them and could roll. Sharkos, which was an enemy mount, I believe, was my personal favorite and yet another of my favorite toys growing up. I could really just go on and on about every figure and creature in this line. There was even a playset in the line, but unfortunately I didn't have that one. There was no animated series or anything of that nature, but there was a mini-comic which came with certain figures. And now it's time for an honorable mention, and that's a line that absolutely should have been on this list. I like it as much, if not more, than some of the ones on this list, but I simply forgot about them. And that's Dragon Riders of the Styx. And this was a small, I guess, G.I. Joe-sized line of fantasy-style action figures. I'll try to find a place to talk about them in the future. I don't know, we'll see. I actually really dug doing the notes for this episode and was really excited to cover toys again here. So, knowing that, how excited I am about it, this episode will probably flop. And number 1 on the list, Advanced Dungeons & Dragons from 1983 to 1984. That doesn't sound right. That's what my notes say, and my notes rarely lie to me. And this line was by LJN. And I know LJN has a bad reputation because of their video game output, but I didn't really play many of those. I knew LJN mostly for their toys, and in toys, they excelled. Thundercats being another one of their lines, which, thinking about it now, I probably could have put that one on the list as well. But so I digress. AD&D was a toy line based on the role-playing game of the same name. Surprisingly, not the animated series, also from 1983, though there was a little crossover. Some of the characters from the toy line, Warduke, Strongheart, and Kellic, each appeared in one episode of the show. Now this was an amazing line that featured action figures, bendy monsters, PVC monsters, miniatures, mounts, and playsets. And it was in the PVC figures that the line really shined. These non-articulated, detailed monsters were just a treasure trove for a monster kid and sword and sorcery fan in the 80s. Where else were you going to get a Minotaur, or a Troll, or an Umber Hulk figure? I easily got the most use out of these, especially the Shambling Mound, which I've talked about before, or will talk about before, depending when this video goes up. I have so many good memories attached to this line. I also had the playset, the Fortress of Fangs, which was quite unique in that it was a place to actually have adventures, not your usual base for bad guys or a base for good guys. Now, an interesting thing about this line, some of the original characters would go on to feature in actual Dungeons & Dragons and have a lasting legacy. Just recently, NECA Toys has been producing a nice line of remade figures from the action figure side of the AD&D line. And that's almost all the time we have for this week, but I'd like to take a quick moment to give a big thank you to FigureRealm.com, which is absolutely one of my favorite websites, and one of the best resources for toys on the net. I've been going to that site for years, not only for research purposes, but just to reminisce and discover old toy lines I might have missed. Yeah, check those guys out. So please like, comment, subscribe, and keep it wacky.